Hey everybody, today I'm going to do a Soul Level 1 playthrough of Dark Souls 2 and just kind of comment on some various things that I notice about the game from the lens of doing a Soul Level 1 playthrough. This is a challenge run that I've been meaning to do for a while. It was popular back in Demon Souls and Dark Souls, and I wanted to do again here in Dark Souls 2. There will be spoilers throughout this video, as I'll be walking through the entire game from start to finish, and I might skip through, or I might skip around rather, but because it's a Soul Level 1 playthrough, there's no real progression, so you're not missing anything. And I set my build pretty early, so you'll be able to see the weapon and armor that I'm rolling around with pretty soon in the video. One of the first things that I noticed as I was starting this playthrough was the initial trailer actually sets up the game pretty nicely. I know that it asks a lot of questions, and the game itself doesn't really answer a lot of those questions, so I don't think in the context of the entire game it's necessarily an effective trailer. But for a new player, particularly when I first started playing the series and watched this trailer for the first time, it really grabs you because it sets up this mysterious place, Drangleic. You're not really sure what's going on. You're really intrigued. You want to sort of solve this mystery. And I think it does a good job of hooking you, even though it doesn't really end up delivering by the end of the game. The very first thing I noticed actually after creating my character was that I wasn't sure what starting weapon I wanted to use. There is a dagger in Things Betwixt that you get as you finish the tutorial, but it's not really significantly better than your fists, and dagger type weapons were also nerfed in a recent patch. So I don't know if this was an intentional concession for Soul Level 1 playthroughs, or if it was just like an extra bonus for players who completed all of the tutorial, but really, you can easily get by with your fists until you get to Melentia, and I don't think you get much of an advantage from grabbing this dagger. As I was kind of proceeding through and getting to Majula, I was trying to figure out what weapon I wanted to end up using for the playthrough. So, one thing that's interesting about the base level playthrough in Dark Souls 2, in comparison with the two previous games, is that you start as a character with even stats across the board. You're not started as, say, a Pyromancer in Dark Souls 1 or a Royal in Demon Souls, both of which have somewhat focused stats and kind of give you an idea of how you should play through the game and where you should focus on in terms of your equipment. The Deprived class doesn't really lend itself to anything, and because it's very difficult to use spells because of your low intelligence, and you can't really use ranged weapons because of your low dexterity and strength, you're effectively forced to two-hand either a mace or a club. Even using a shield is pretty limited because the only shield I could find that I could use was the Crimson Parma, which you find on the way to Hade. I ended up going with the club because I use a mace pretty frequently when I'm just playing through the game for fun, and I wanted to try out the club and see how it is. The first part of the game is pretty straightforward. I think I'll go ahead and skip right to the last giant. What I found interesting about this fight is that it was actually nerfed in one of the earlier patches, and it was never clarified by FromSoft why it was nerfed, but I suspect that this was actually a concession in new players, because the Foot Stomp used to one-shot me at least when I was going through on my first playthrough as a bandit. Here, it certainly would have one-shotted me as a level 1 character if the boss hadn't been nerfed. I know that some folks had some issues with this because they felt like they were making the game easier. Personally, I never found the last giant to be a particularly difficult boss. I think the real difficulty spike in this game happens around the Ruined Sentinels, which we'll get to later. So I think it's a pretty reasonable decision not to have the first, real boss one-shot you. In contrast with the previous games, it's not like there is a tutorial boss which you get through and then you get to the real game. With the last giant, you've already been playing for a while, so it's probably pretty frustrating to get to a boss after having played for 5 or 6 hours on your first playthrough and not be able and get one-shotted by him. And so I kind of understand why they made that concession, and I think it was a pretty good decision. So while I fight the next couple of bosses, there's not a whole lot to talk about, so I think I'll kind of talk about other types of challenge runs. The most common challenge runs in Dark Souls 2 are no death and no bonfire runs, and of course doing that simultaneously. If you complete these runs, you get a couple of pretty good rings, so they're arguably the officially sanctioned challenge runs, so to speak, in that they're formally recognized by the game in some way. It's as if the developers are kind of quietly encouraging you to try out these challenge runs as something that the game has, in one way or another, been designed around. No Death, No Bonfire run in New Game is probably the challenge run in Dark Souls 2, because it's certainly the hardest way of doing either the No Death or the No Bonfire run, and like I mentioned, it's officially sanctioned, so it's kind of recognized by the game in some way. Of course, the Souls games lend themselves to challenge runs, and there's a huge variety of runs I could talk about, but I think I'll talk about these in particular because I think they're the challenge runs that most people most commonly end up doing. What I find interesting about these runs, and challenge runs in general, is the way they tweak the parameters of the game in order to add additional difficulty. As I've mentioned in the past, I don't really think additional difficulty is a metric worth measuring. I don't think that difficulty by itself actually accomplishes anything. I think I'll judge the efficacy of a challenge run by the experience that a player has while they're doing the run. Is it something that they feel accomplished by completing? Is it fun? Is it something that they look back on and they're glad that they did it? Or is it just really tedious and the player doesn't really get anything out of it? That's kind of how I judge challenge runs in terms of whether or not I think people should do them, whether or not I think I should do them myself. So what's interesting about the No Death, No Bonfire run, to me from this perspective, is that it really ignores most of the fundamental mechanics in the game. Particularly, the No Bonfire aspect kind of contradicts the core level design of Dark Souls 2 because the levels are mostly linear. And it was pointed out in another video that I saw that the Primal Bonfire taking you back to Majula and not counting against the No Bonfire achievement is probably a concession to just make this run possible, because otherwise it wouldn't be doable. You would get stuck at the end of one of the old soul bosses. In addition to that, because you can't repair equipment that's partially damaged without using a very expensive item, the No Death, No Bonfire run ends up having players kind of banging their club or their mace against a wall in Majula to break it so that they can have Lenograst repair it. That seems very tedious to me. It doesn't seem very interesting. Finally, the official stats show that around 20% of deaths are just due to falling if you exclude PvP. And generally, falling to your death isn't so much a measure of your skill or your knowledge as it is a measure of whether or not you got a good camera angle, whether or not you were being careful, whether or not you got careless a little bit. I kind of understand the argument that people make that the challenge run is about not being careless. It's about being careful. It's about really proving that you have what it takes to complete this kind of run. And I just don't think that perfection is a skill that Dark Souls or Dark Souls 2 or the Soul series in general rewards. I think these games really reward learning the mechanics of the game. I think once you've learned the core mechanics of the Souls games, they're actually not particularly difficult games. The difficulty is not in your technical execution, it's in understanding what you have to do and then executing on it. And certainly sometimes that's pretty hard, and I think the Fume Knight fight is a good example of a fight where you do need some pretty good technical execution in order to be successful. But I as a whole, I think the games reward learning about the game, not about being perfect. And I think that kind of shows in the way that people end up tackling these challenges. The most common way I've seen folks tackle them is to wait until they're in New Game Plus with an over-leveled character who just kind of stomps all of the enemies who are in their way. I don't think this is a particularly fun experience. I think it lends itself to cheesing. I think it doesn't provide a player with the sense of accomplishment that I think the run was intended to provide. I do think that going through the No Death, No Bonfire run in New Game and consciously trying not to cheese, consciously trying not to summon and all that stuff, I think that would provide a sense of accomplishment, but it just seems really tedious, and it doesn't seem to align well with the fundamental mechanics of the game. So I don't think that these are challenge runs that are really well thought through. Just going back to the previous games in the series, there didn't need to be an officially sanctioned challenge run for there to be interesting challenge runs for these games. But like I said, there are so many parameters and so many mechanics. Players themselves can come up with interesting challenge runs to do. And I don't think the development team needs to specifically design challenge runs for players. In particular, designing a challenge run that's just inherently very, very difficult and inherently focused on perfection, I don't think that really emphasizes the strengths of the series. And again, I think that emphasizes difficulty rather than the actual experience the player is having while they play the game. Of course, all that being said, a Soul Level 1 run isn't ideal either, largely because, again, like I said, the deprived character isn't really built to do anything useful. You have a very limited weapon set, you have a very limited sort of things that you can do. You can't use ranged weapons, you can't use spells. It's effectively a melee-only build. On top of that, it interacts pretty poorly with soul memory in that any invasion is almost guaranteed to be an instant death. So I don't think a Soul Level 1 run is necessarily that much better than other types of challenge runs, but I do think it meshes better with the core mechanics. In particular, the fact that you can die, you can make mistakes, you can learn, you can try new things, the fact that it doesn't punish you heavily for failure, for death, I think is important. Because the fact that just falling off a ledge, halfway through the game can completely end at no death or no bonfire run, I think that makes it unnecessarily tedious and unnecessarily focused on perfection. I'll talk a little bit about what's actually going on the screen. I think I'll talk about the Ruined Sentinels fight. I know that this is not one of the most popular bosses in the game. I know that this was, when the game first came out, it was definitely a game breaker for some people. I saw several forum posts of folks saying that they got to this boss and they got stuck and they decided that this was the point where they would stop playing the game. And I think that that's really a shame, because I do agree that this is definitely the biggest difficulty spike in Dark Souls 2, but I think it's a great one. The player is set up first on this ledge where they get to fight a single Ruined Sentinel. The thing about this ledge is that it really forces you to learn the enemy's moveset, because you can't run away. If you drop down, you know you're going to get jumped by the other two, so you have to stay up on this ledge and really understand what your strategy is for dealing with this guy. In addition to that, the moveset of the Ruined Sentinels is really, really well choreographed. In contrast with another multi-boss fight, which we'll talk about a little later, the Throne Watcher and Throne Defender, you know as soon as the Ruined Sentinel starts their attack animation, you know exactly how many attacks they're going to do, and how powerful they're going to be and where they're going to happen. So there's no ambiguity, there's no luck involved, so to speak. And finally, even at this level, even at level 1 with just a +5 club, I kill these guys in 6 or 7 hits, so they're not particularly powerful enemies. So once you enter this fight, you're forced to learn the moveset of the first guy, and then you fight the other two guys. Once you beat these guys, you really feel, or at least I felt, a really sincere sense of accomplishment. Because there's very little ambiguity in this fight, and because you're really forced to figure them out, because there's 2 of them, and because they give you one to figure out at the beginning, it really forces you to grow as a player, whether it's, figuring out how to handle your shield better, figuring out how to roll better, figuring out how to be patient, figuring out how to time your heals. It's a very well-designed fight in that it delivers that sense of accomplishment without being overly difficult, because it eliminates that ambiguity. Overall, I think it's a pretty well-done fight, and I get that it's a game breaker for some folks, and I think that that's a bummer. So one thing that I noticed as I was going through this run, as I mentioned earlier, is that you can't really effectively use a shield in a Soul Level 1 run. The only shield that I could effectively use was the Crimson Parma, which you find on the way to Hade. And what's interesting about this shield is that it has no requirements on it, but it's still about as good as any other starter shield. It has a base physical defense of 75% and a base stability of 35%, which is not very good, but for a starter shield with no stats, that's a pretty good shield. And I would argue it's actually better than the Buckler or the Small Cleric shield, which you pick up later. Not because it's significantly better shield, but just because it has no stat requirements, and any player can use it. I think they put this shield here largely as a concession to new players. In case new players wandered into Hade first, instead of going to the Forest of Fallen Giants, they at least had a halfway decent shield that they could use until they realized that they were supposed to turn back. And that's something that was really revealing to me as I did this low-level run, was that there are a lot of concessions in the game for players who are new and who haven't played the Souls series before, and it seems like the devs did do some things to try to help new players in particular. And I know that the developers in previous games did a lot of things to ensure that not just new players, but really anyone, if they were paying attention, could determine what was going to happen and could play carefully and could do the right thing based on their awareness rather than on trial and error. I get that that was kind of reduced in Dark Souls 2, having played Dark Souls. I do think that Dark Souls 2 does make an extra effort in comparison with those previous games about particularly helping new players. Moving on to the fight with Mytha, one thing that this fight really reveals is how much the game relies on agility for roll effectiveness. In Dark Souls 1, low levels could roll as well as high level players just by reducing their equipment burden. But in Dark Souls 2, not only do you have to lower your equipment burden, you also have to put points into either attunement or adaptability in order to increase your agility stat. And one thing that I learned as I was going through this run is that the combination of wonky hitboxes and really low agility meant that I was getting hit by things that I would never expect to get hit by before. I usually play through these games with a high adaptability character two-handing a weapon, and I almost never use a shield except for when I fight the Lost Sinner. In these fights I found it pretty difficult to dodge every attack, and I found myself getting hit pretty frequently. I'm pretty thankful that I had a lot of life gems lying around, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I was really surprised how much of an impact agility has on your ability to roll until I did this run where I had no agility and I couldn't use a shield, as I mentioned before. I actually think that because of the wonky hitboxes and the unpredictability of it all, this is actually the most frustrating part of the low-level run. I actually didn't mind not doing very much damage later on in the game, and I didn't mind having very much health. It was a bummer to expect to dodge something and to get hit as if from nowhere. And one thing that brought to mind as I was going through the game was that I realized how much under-leveled I was on subsequent playthroughs of the game in comparison with my first playthrough. When I first played through the game, I was probably around level 130 or 135 by the time I finished the game, whereas I was looking at a recent character that I was playing through, and I was attempting a no-death run, and I was level 72 by the time I got to Iron Keep, which put me on track to be around level 100 by the time I finished the game. And the interesting thing is that because of the importance of adaptability, and because of the importance of vigor, it really is impactful to be at a lower level as you progress through the game than it is, I think, in previous games. In previous games, you could really avoid taking damage almost all of the time, whereas in Dark Souls 2, particularly with multi-enemy boss fights, it's pretty hard to do so. And having that extra health and those extra iframes around proves to be really useful. And so what I find really interesting about this, as you get better at the game and as you play through it more and more, you're actually handicapping yourself inherently because you're moving through the game so much faster. You're ending up at a lower level by the later levels. And because the game does kind of reward bulldozing your way through the game, it kind of punishes players who have been playing for a long time and who end up progressing farther in the game than where they were intended to. I think that the game was balanced around players going through the game for the first time, exploring everything, getting all the souls, killing all the enemies, potentially farming some areas out completely, despawning some enemies. For example, the first DLC, I saw in a Let's Play video from a German spy that the level recommendation for that area was level 200. I've only hit level 200 on one of my characters, and I did so very intentionally. I ended up farming the Giant Lord several times in order to get the souls necessary to get to that level. And that was because I did it on a character I did it on a subsequent playthrough where I finished the game around, I think, level 110 or 115. I mentioned a little bit earlier that the game, I think, is designed for bulldozing your way through, and I kind of wanted to touch on that because I think the Soul Level 1 run, more than anything, kind of highlights some of the problems in the game's design, because in contrast with previous games where you could really largely avoid taking damage, in this game that's a lot harder. So I think the biggest data point around this is the auto-tracking. It's really, really difficult to avoid getting hit by enemies without using a shield. And I think that the design was intentional. I think that players were intended to bulldoze their way and kind of tank their way through certain encounters. I don't think that Melentia was accidentally placed in Majula with infinite life gems. I think that was very intentional. I think it was sort of a prompt for players to say, hey, here's an infinite supply of very cheap healing items. Here is, kind of a hint on how you should be playing through the game. And I think the limited early Estus and the no way to kindle bonfires plays into that. It encourages players to use healing items. I think the fact that there are often multiple enemies where you can only see one because of the lock-on system, I don't think that's necessarily intentional for them to have a camera that doesn't work very well, but I do think it was intentional for the player to kind of tank their way through those encounters. I think the intention was the developer wanted players to bulldoze their way through those encounters. And the thing is, at level 1, you really notice that, because by the time you get to Drangleic Castle and beyond, most bosses will two-shot you. You really notice when the game intends for you to take damage because you die. As I was progressing through the game, I did notice that I had a ton of extra souls lying around. One thing that kind of irritates me is when people say that this is an advantage, like when they constrain themselves and they say, oh, I can't spend souls on this, and that's an advantage because I can spend them on this instead. That's not really true, obviously. Like, if you have, n number of decisions that you can take, and one decision is the ideal decision, but you can't take it, so you take a less ideal decision, that doesn't mean that that's an advantage. It's not an advantage to not make the ideal choice. It's an advantage to make the ideal choice. So I wouldn't say it's an advantage to have extra souls lying around so you can buy extra consumables and extra other items. It definitely did change the way I played through the game, though. I used resins a lot more until I ended up infusing my club. I used life gems a lot more. I even bought bright bugs. For this run, I did end up not using any DLC items. I wanted to kind of do just a vanilla playthrough of the game. With all the extra souls you have lying around, you can buy bright bugs, which is important because they're a very powerful item. As I went through Amana, I really did notice how poorly designed this section is for melee only. I should mention again that in one of the earlier patches, the homing arrows of the priestesses who fire at you was nerfed, so they actually don't lock on as well as they used to. But in any case, it's still not a very well-designed area for melee-only characters, and I really do think that this area was designed for cheesing. I think the developers intended for you to slowly inch your way through, shooting down each priest one by one with a bow or a crossbow or a spell, instead of trying to take them on with melee. One of the data points there is that a lot of the enemies link, so as you're fighting one enemy, another enemy will start hitting you, and particularly when it comes to those homing arrows, that's really hard to dodge. So I don't really understand what they were trying to go for in this area. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Amana, because I know it's something that a lot of people complain about. I know a lot of people say that it's their least favorite section in the game. But again, I just want to highlight the way that doing a challenge run really makes you think about the mechanics of the game and the way the game is designed. Because you're actively limiting yourself on one sort of vertical of the game, it forces you to think about how the other verticals interact with each other and how things would be different if you weren't doing that challenge run. In a way that you wouldn't necessarily think of doing when you're just playing through the game normally. Finally, I think we can kind of skip towards the Throne Watcher and the Throne Defender. So this is a really interesting fight. When I was doing this challenge run, I wanted to avoid summoning completely for any boss, and I was successful with that until I got to the Throne Watcher and the Throne Defender. And the reason I ended up deciding to summon is because I think this boss fight was really designed for co-op. Because the way the Throne Watcher and the Throne Defender heal each other, and because there's a huge amount of unpredictability in their attacks, one can swing 2 times or 3 times or 4 times, and they can actually swing through each other, so a lot of the time you can't even see one of the bosses and what they're doing. I really think it was designed for co-op, where one player would either one player would tank both of them and the other player would do damage, or each player would take one of the enemies and you would each beat your respective boss, and that would be the end of the fight. What I found interesting about this is that 6 or maybe 8 months ago, I probably would have gone into this fight and I would have said, okay, this is a challenge run, soul level 1 run, I'm going to do this without summoning, and it would have been really, really, really frustrating. And the thing about having this channel and making these videos and thinking about game design, I find that I have a lot more clarity about my opinions. I feel like I'm more mindful about what's going on around me and why the game is doing the things that it's doing. Sometimes I'll get frustrated with a game and think, like, why did they do this? And then I'll actually think to myself, why did they do this? And a lot of the time I realize, actually, I'm not playing this right, I'm not playing smart, I just need to get better, I need to do this better. And sometimes I think to myself, actually, this section is really poorly designed. I think I'm going to do something else, or maybe I'm not going to play this game anymore, or maybe I'll lower the difficulty for this section because I think it's not very well designed at all. It's really brought a lot of calm and a lot of clarity to the way that I play games. I don't feel like I'm constrained by this arbitrary feeling of having to beat every game on the hardest difficulty and do all this and do all that, because I feel like I finally have an understanding and a mindfulness of the way that games are designed and what's kind of going on around me. Now, obviously, I have a lot more to learn about game design, and I'm really excited to keep learning, but so far it's been a really good experience. Once the Throne Watcher and the Throne Defender are dead, there's not really much to say about Nishandra, so I guess I'll talk about some of the impacts the DLCs have on a Soul Level 1 playthrough, and what changes I hope to see in Scholar of the First Sin. So the DLC adds a couple of really, really interesting items in the form of rings that increase your base stats. And I think this has the potential to really change the mechanics of a Soul Level 1 run. Like I said, in the base game, you're pretty limited in the terms of your weapon choice, because you only have 6 strength and 6 dex. But the DLCs offer dex and strength rings that increase your base stats by 5. So that potentially allows you to use a weapon with up to 22 strength and a minimum 11 dex requirement. I think that opens up a lot more interesting possibilities. Like I said, it's something that I decided against doing for this run because I wanted to just run through the vanilla game. I think that if you're trying to design an ideal Soul Level 1 run, you wanted to do it right, you wanted to do it perfectly, you definitely want to think about how you would incorporate those items into your build, because I think they really change the underlying dynamics of how you would do this run. I think it really opens up a lot of possibilities. And the other thing that I think that's important from the DLCs is the Brightbug item. It really increases your attack power and reduces your ability to get killed. It's a really, really powerful item. Like I said, I didn't end up using it at all. I never ended up summoning either, except for the Throne Watcher and Throne Defender. And even with them, I think you can beat them solo. You just have to be really, really, really patient, to the point of where I was actually getting bored trying to solo them. So I think a Brightbug might be an interesting choice there, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the dynamics of the run. I think it just makes certain fights easier if you need a little bit of extra help. Okay, I think that's kind of all of the thoughts that I had as I went through this run. It was a pretty fun run. If you're thinking about doing a challenge run of Dark Souls 2, I highly recommend a Soul Level 1 run. Definitely over a no death or no bonfire run, like I mentioned before. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much for your time. Take care.